Welcome to this video podcast of the Trauma Professionals blog. This podcast is brought to you by the Regions Hospital Trauma Programs in St. Paul, Minnesota, and includes the Level 1 Adult Trauma Center and the Level 1 Trauma Center for Children. It is produced by Dr. Michael McGonigal, the Director of Trauma Services at Regions Hospital.
It is Minnesota and it is still wintertime, so the topic of snowmobile injuries comes up fairly frequently. So I'm going to dedicate this broadcast to dealing with some of the specifics of snowmobile injuries. There are three things that I'll be doing. First, I'm going to review a brief history of snowmobile use, primarily here in the States. I'm going to look at some recent data on injuries regarding snowmobile usage and trauma that can occur from this. And then finally, since many of the folks listening to this broadcast do deal with primary care as well as prevention, I'm going to provide some basic safety tips for riders that you can pass on to your patients. First, let's delve into the history. The very first crude vehicle that actually traveled on top of the snow was invented in 1909, and it really doesn't look like anything that we use anymore today. But there was some interest in this, especially in the northern climates in the States, and ultimately, just a few years later, a conversion kit for the Model T Ford was actually developed so that it could travel on snow. And there was a dealer who sold this kit who first coined the term snowmobile. Obviously a combination of snow and automobile, and that's what the Model T Ford was at the time. The actual machine that was probably the closest precursor to the modern snowmobile was actually constructed in Wisconsin in 1924, and it was a motor toboggan. It actually had a steel track, kind of an endless steel track similar to what we use today, and it was actually propelled by the outboard motor from a boat, and it actually did work fairly well. For those of you who are viewing video of this broadcast, I actually have a picture of one of the adapter kits for the Model T Ford, which is quite entertaining vehicle. In 1954, Polaris, which is a Minnesota company, developed the first modern snowmobile. Now, Polaris went by a different name back then and primarily was a manufacturer of farming equipment. And this device was constructed and was used by some of the employees, and ultimately they were told to get rid of it, and so they put it up for sale and were surprised that it sold very, very quickly. So they started looking at this and ultimately started experimenting, building some different models of it. One of the early issues they had was the reliability was bad, and typically when they went out snowmobiling, at least the company models, they actually sent two out together so that one could be used to tow the broken one back to the shop. Ultimately, Polaris phased out their farm equipment part of the business and began focusing on snowmobiles, and now these days they actually develop ATVs, snowmobiles, and other types of motorized vehicles. If you look at the statistics, snowmobiles are very popular, especially in the northern climates. In the United States, in the year 2009, which is the most recent year we have complete information for registrations on, there are 1.6 million current snowmobile registrations. The top state for registration is Michigan with 346,000. Minnesota is second at 252, and Wisconsin isn't far behind at 220,000. Now, the next nearest state is less than 100,000 registrations. So those three states really provide the bulk of the registrations. In Canada, also, as you can imagine, snowmobiling is pretty popular. But none of their registrations in any of the provinces exceed what Michigan is in the United States. In the year 2010, there were about a little over 48,000 snowmobiles sold in the United States, about 111,000 sold nationwide. So, popular vehicles. Let's shift gears and look at some of the hard data that we have on snowmobile safety. There was a big surge in studies on snowmobile safety and accidents in the 1990s, and really these ended pretty much in the early 2000s. The most recent big study was a Canadian study that was done that looked at 10 years of their experience. It was published in about 2003, 2004, and it looked at data through the 1990s. And it was a full 10 years of information, and they accumulated information on 294 people who sustained a total of 480 injuries. Ultimately, this means that there were a lot of injuries per person. Most of the people who sustained injuries lived in rural settings, and that's true in other studies in the States as well. Musculoskeletal injuries are most common. Injuries about the knee area are by far the most common, and this includes the knee itself as well as the tibial plateau and the distal femur. Spine fractures and spine injuries are the next most common musculoskeletal injuries. Other areas are injured as well. 17% of injuries occur to the chest, 13% incidence of head injury, and about the same, 13% of injuries involve the abdomen as well. The location of the snowmobile is also very interesting. Only 16% of snowmobile crashes actually occurred on trails. 31% of them occurred on roads. Speed was a factor in the vast majority. 82% of riders were going faster than 30 miles an hour, 38% faster than 40, and about 1/6 of them were going faster than 50 miles an hour at the time. Probably the most troubling statistic was that 88% of riders had alcohol on board, and 70% actually had values that were over the legal limit at 0.08%. Time of day information was also very interesting. A little over 2/3 occurred during reduced light times, and that extends from sunset to sunrise, and 18% occurred after midnight, so very, very dark at that point. Looking at the mechanism of the crash, there were 72% of these were actual crashes or collisions, and about 1/3 of them hit some kind of bump. It could have been a rise in the snow, a tree stump, something that propelled the sled up into the air. 18% just suffered a loss of control for one reason or another, and 10% of injuries actually occurred when the rider fell off the vehicle. Here are some tips that you can share with your patients. Some of these begin even before they leave the house. First, avoid hypothermia, so dress properly. Make sure that you have a windproof exterior to their clothing, and make sure that the layers underneath are properly layered to maintain maximum warmth. A helmet is absolutely mandatory. Most riders these days do wear their helmets because it keeps their face from getting too cold, but it also is extremely important in reducing the severity and incidence of head injuries. Riders should never travel alone. Really, they need to buddy up so they can have maximum safety. If somebody has a mishap, they've got somebody else who is there to try to get them out of trouble. It's also very important to make sure that these folks are not traveling without anybody else knowing that they're out. Make sure that they've told people where they're going and approximately when they'll be returning. Since speed is an issue, it's important to maintain reasonable speeds. Make sure that the driver does not go faster than they can see or react. It's also important to stay on marked trails. For the most part, these will be the safest, but always keep an eye out for fences, wires, stumps, other things that can interfere with the steering of the sled. Be extremely cautious when crossing roads. A substantial number of crashes take place on roads, and when it comes to a car versus snowmobile, the sled almost always loses. Probably one of the most important things is to don't drink and ride. Alcohol has a very high association with snowmobile crashes, so it's extremely important to try to be sober while sledding. Since reduced visibility sets people up for more crashes, use extreme caution at night. Avoid traveling across lakes. Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes, there are lots of opportunities to get out there. It seems very nice because it's smooth. There are relatively few obstructions. Unfortunately, even in the coldest of weather, ice thickness may vary, and it is possible to go through the ice and end up in the water. And this is a sure recipe for disaster. Finally, carry a first aid kit with some basic survival supplies, so if something does happen, at least you can keep yourself alive during those first few minutes to hours so that other people can come to your assistance and help. This information will also be posted on my blog, the Trauma Professionals blog, and you can find this at regionstraumaPro.com. Regions is spelled R-E-G-I-O-N-S. So it's all one word, regionstraumaPro.com. You can follow me on Twitter at regionstrauma, and pretty much anything I post will have the hashtag of TraumaPro, one word. Thanks, and I'm always interested in hearing questions, so please feel free to send me emails or send me questions via the blog, and I will certainly be happy to provide any information that you want.